Well, hello and welcome to the latest episode of CIB in Conversation. I'm Don Ward, I'm the Chief Executive of CIB. And in this series, we like to meet the personalities behind some of the leaders in research and innovation across the globe. I'm delighted to say that today's guest is Chrisna du Plessis, Head of Department at Department of Architecture and Chair of the School for the Built Environment at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. I should say Chrisna is also former Chair of the CIB Programme Committee and has a long and distinguished involvement with CIB, including our working commissions and particularly around the subject of smart cities and sustainability. And she gave a highly acclaimed keynote speech at our World Building Congress in 2019 in Hong Kong. So it's a great pleasure today to welcome Chrisna du Plessis. Hello.
Hi, Don. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate this.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and really appreciate your time today. Thank you. So what we like to do is kick off this conversation, Chrisna, by asking you about your early career, really, and how did you come into the world of research and innovation in built environment?
I think in many ways, I am the poster case of the wild child that was saved by the CIB. I was falling around in my 20s and early 30s, not really knowing what I was going to do, and working with various projects around informal housing, low-cost housing, and development facilitation. And then for a number of personal reasons, my whole world collapsed, and I ended up middle of the month realizing I have zero money left in the bank. And in that moment thought, well, there's one way of getting money very quickly, and that is to register for a master's degree and then get a student loan. So that's how I entered the world of research. Then 6 months later, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa advertised the position. It's a 6-month contract to come and do research on crime prevention through environmental design. And I thought, this is research. I'm busy with a master's. I'm sure I can do this. Applied for the job and they turned me down.
Wow. Yeah.
Terrible. But at that point, I was doing my master's on what does sustainable development mean for construction and for the built environment. So my supervisor suggested I go and do a presentation at the Commonwealth Association of Architects conference in India about this. Went off, did the presentation. I came back and there is a telephone call message waiting for me from the people at the CSIR saying, am I still interested in a position at the CSIR? And I said, of course, yes, because I'm flat broke. Joined them for 6 months. And while I was on my 6-month probation, my then director, Rodney Milford, who was the past president of the CIB, said, well, you're busy doing this stuff on sustainable building and sustainable construction. And there's a meeting in Paris that's organized by this organization called the CIB. Would you be interested in going? We'll pay for you to go, but you're not allowed to say anything. You're only there as an observer. So I flew off to Paris and I'm sitting in this meeting hall, very fancy, and there are all these distinguished professors, and I'm the youngest and the only female around the table. And it took me about an hour before I could no longer keep quiet. And the outcome of that was that I ended up going back to South Africa and had to write the South African chapter of the Agenda 21 for Sustainable Construction and the Built Environment. And I had like 9 days to do it in. Did that, and that's how my career started with the CIB. And obviously, I did something right because the CSIR then offered to extend my contract and extended, and eventually I stayed about 13 years at the CSIR, working in the field of sustainable human settlements.
Excellent. Well, it might be good fortune, but I suspect we make our own luck, don't we? So, congratulations certainly for taking advantage of that opportunity at the time. Rodney Milford, I think, was the first CIB president that I met.
Okay.
A splendid fellow. So that would have been about early 2000s, something like that. So yeah, would he have been one of your early career mentors?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, Rodney taught me everything I knew, and from him I also learned how to speak with engineers. Architects and engineers talk different languages, and he really helped me to think through how do you present things and step away from this intuitive understanding of this is how we know this is how it needs to happen, to figuring out how to structure arguments, how to get the evidence together so that I can convince the engineers that this is actually what needs to happen. And that also then, of course, helped me quite a lot in my own research career, because that's how you structure research.
Yes.
So I owe Rodney an enormous debt.
And I mean, would you have any advice for potential mentors or mentorees, for that matter, in terms of what makes that relationship a strong one that really helps both parties?
I think it's important to have a sense of mutual trust, and that it's a trust that goes both ways. So it is about you as the mentee trusting that you can be there and you can say things that may seem career limiting or that is challenging, and I think I was quite a challenging individual in my youth. My PhD supervisor, Peter Brandon, who was also I met through the CIB, always joked and said that I supervised him and that I was the one who gave the instructions. So you need to have that level of comfort with each other to know that this is a collegial relationship. It is not a power relationship. And I think that's from both sides that needs to come in. And of course, there's a level of respect that you have as a mentee to your mentor for what they can teach you, and the appreciation. I think it's always important to remember what it is that they're giving you incredibly valuable time, not just their knowledge, but their time as well, and to appreciate that. But then from now, where I'm sitting now in a position where I have to start mentoring young researchers, it's also important to see, not to try and impose my own thoughts and my own ideas about where they should do and what they can do on them, but to help them to discover what it is that's really their passion, and then to see what are the doors that I can open for them, more than anything else.
Very, very sound advice. Thank you. As you know, this series is watched by a lot of students and early career researchers. So it's that type of advice, I think, which is sort of what we're hoping people can take away from this conversation. I mean, from that period in your career, is there another piece of advice or a tip that you might want to pass on?
This one is for females in the building industry.
Nice.
Now, we constantly hear about women in construction, and it's such a struggle to be a woman in construction. And in many cases, it's true, but it's also helped me tremendously, because at that stage, as I said, I was the only woman in the room. So people saw me. And because I was not afraid, I was not a sort of wilting violet, too scared to speak up, they also listened to me. And I think that helped in many ways, that to make yourself visible. So and I think it's not just for women, it's to think about how your unique attributes and contributions can help you to stand out so that people notice you. And not be afraid to step up and say, listen, yes, I will do this. I mean, coming back from that, I literally didn't sleep for a week and a half to prepare that chapter. But doing that, making that effort, putting in that intention into this is what I want to do, and I want to do it as best as I can, not about trying to impress somebody, but because there was a personal pride involved in doing this and showing that I can do. I ended up with the unenviable task of putting together the Agenda 21 for sustainable construction in developing countries. Another position that I got, or another job I got, because I was not afraid to stand up and question what was happening at the moment, to sort of poke the holes in the accepted ways of doing things, to push people and say, you're not going far enough, you are not thinking wide enough, you are not including all the things that you need to do if you want to have a systemic understanding of this problem. So don't be scared to push things, don't be scared to question, and don't be scared to stand up there and challenge and say, this can be done better.
I don't think anyone could ever have accused you of being a wilting violet, Chrisna, but that advice, I'm sure, will land very fertile soil. That really is great to listen to. There we were with you, having done a master's. You'd spent a number of years at CSIR. What influenced your decision to go on to do a PhD and perhaps move into the world of academia from then?
I always knew that the CSIR was sort of, for me, a bit of a stepping stone. I wanted to change hearts and minds. My field that I'm working in, sustainability, is very much about not just the technology, but about how people look at things and about the worldviews that we have. And in an organization that is about industrial research, dealing with worldviews and dealing with soft issues and dealing with changing behavior is not necessarily an area where there's a lot of research being done in, and where that you're encouraged to invest time in. And I realized that if I wanted to go to university, I needed to have a PhD. I was also incredibly fortunate in that, as I said, I met Peter Brandon, who in many ways pursued me over a couple of years to say, come and do a PhD at Salford. And eventually he managed to organize it in such a way that I could do a PhD in Salford from South Africa, doing it part-time, which broke all the rules at that stage. But from that, it allowed me to say, well, I can now build myself up as an academic. The other thing that I realized through my involvement in the CIB was that it gives you credibility. And I only realized much later, and something I tell to my students and my staff now, because as architects, research is not necessarily something that we think about. When you are already established and you've got a nice little cushy job in a place like the CSIR, you don't necessarily think about improving your qualifications. You are focusing on the work. But if you want to access funding from outside, if you want to participate as a respected academic, you need that PhD. It's not the magnus opus you do at the end of your career where you write up your life lessons. It is the entry ticket. So you need to get that entry ticket to allow you to have a foot and a standing within this broader game of academia.
Very well reasoned, I can see that. What subject did you do your PhD in?
Topic of my PhD, and I have to remember it. It is, goodness, that's good. That's a very good question. It's about an ecological worldview and urban sustainability. I can't remember the exact framework, but it was about how an ecological worldview influences the way that we think about urban sustainability.
And then, and having done that PhD with Peter at Salford, where did you find your first academic, your first postdoctorate position?
Oh, postdoctorates. No, I never did a postdoc.
Sorry, so your first position
that's luxuries for people who are sitting in the first world. In the third world, finished my PhD, and then I moved to the University of Pretoria, where I worked first. I was moved into a position as associate professor at the Department of Construction Economics, and literally had 5 days to prepare an entire semester's module on HVAC systems. Right. So you're the architect, you know about these things. And again, there the CIB saved my bacon, because I sort of sent out this call for help through my CIB networks and got people from all over the world sending me lecturing material, making suggestions for what I should teach at that level. And I managed to put together this entire course, semester course, in a couple of days, thanks to the CIB network.
You really are a great investment for CIB, aren't you?
Absolutely.
And did your research interests continue along the lines of ecological and urban resilience, or how did that agenda develop for you?
It sort of went in two directions. The one was, again, pushing things, and at this stage, I was already questioning sustainability in the way that we do sustainability with the Millennium Development Goals, the 3 pillars of sustainability, And now we've got the SDGs, and a lot of it looked like it's talking, but it's not really changing hearts and minds. It's not really coming up with something that moves us from a very dysfunctional system to something that would allow us to thrive as a global society. So it's all about how do we make bad things better, and not how do we do a better thing. So I started exploring that and talking about that with another colleague that I met through the CIB at the World Building Congress in Brisbane, Dominique Hess. And we ended up writing a book together called Designing for Hope: Pathways to Regenerative Sustainability. So I started to explore in that process the whole idea of regenerative design, regenerative development, and what that would mean, and how we can go beyond sustainability. So that's my heart and my passion. The other aspect of it was that came out of the PhD is the idea of resilience. We're dealing with social ecological systems, and our cities as a social ecological system. And at that stage, people just started to think about bringing the ecological concept of resilience into urban systems and into built systems. So a lot of what my PhD ended up with is almost a research agenda for urban resilience. And again, here, this is being in the right place, being in the right time, working at the CSIR. I knew the people who were writing the Department of Science and Technology's 10-year science plan. And I was fighting with them at that stage about why is there nothing about the built environment in the government's research agendas. You know, we've got these huge programs around cities and around human settlements, but there's nothing about the research. There's no funding for research in that. And eventually I got this phone call, again, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We've decided that we're going to put a little piece, a stream on urban resilience in the science plan, but we need to submit it tomorrow morning. Do you have something for us? So I could literally take the conclusions of my PhD, sort of wrote a different heading and an ending and emailed it, and that became part of the science plan. And that then allowed me to lead a research program for about 5 years on urban resilience, and how do we translate all these ideas of resilience thinking into an urban context. So what does it mean for cities when we talk about diversity? What is it that we mean for cities if we talk about connectivity and adaptive capacity and things like that? Sadly, and that was also at the time when you started doing all kinds of other things. And the book that we've been writing about this, my colleague Karina Landman and I, for a few years is still sitting in our laptops. We haven't published it, and I don't know if it's even relevant anymore. But we have some very clever ideas around that. So it is pushing in those directions. And then where I'm now sitting at the moment is, again, when you work for an organization and they have these ideas of what cities should be about, or what research should be about. So they all jumped on this 4IR thing, and it's the smart cities thing. And I sort of sent off, oh yes, you head of School of Built Environment, you head of the Department of Architecture, go off and figure out what you're going to do about smart cities. So I entered this whole thing kicking and screaming, saying, is smart cities what we really need to do in our context? If we look at, first of all, the digital divide that we already have in the developing world, and then secondly, looking at the larger things that we have to deal with in terms of climate change and so on, is this really where we need to focus? And if we do, how do we do that? And so out of that, I then got my own postdoc student who's been working on the idea of digital twinning, and how do we use digital twinning to bring in issues of resilience and how cities are planning, and how do you build it as a sort of citizen science and not as a sort of a top-down thing that has been funded by government and has got peak engineering built into it, but really as a way of getting information at the ground level and the grassroots level that can feed into decision making. And that tied in very nicely with my first real role in the CIB, which was in 1989 or 99. Alan Gillam and I started TG38, which was about cities and systems thinking around cities. And then later Bob Giddings joined me as co-coordinator of that. And we realized at that stage that we were so far ahead of the rest of the world that technology didn't exist. But now we actually are back to that kind of way of thinking. How can we use technology to introduce this kind of true systems thinking so that we can have resilience in our cities?
And not to jump ahead too much, or not to disrupt your flow, as it were, but I mentioned earlier that you did such a highly acclaimed keynote presentation at World Building Congress 2019 on the theme of, I suppose, the perils really of approaches to smart cities. Would you like to reprise that for us in 30 seconds or a minute?
If I can remember the gist of it. Well,
I think we'll attach, if we can, we'll attach a link to that keynote for our viewers to be able to have a look if they're really interested. I know it's 2 years ago, but highly rated content at the time. So I hope for further information people can click separately on the link. But how's your resume?
It basically critiqued the whole idea of smart cities and going into smart cities without thinking about what it is that we are doing by introducing all these sensor networks in cities, how vulnerable it really makes us, and how it increases the digital divide between the people who can access digital devices, who can access the data, who even know how to use these digital devices, and the rest of society. I live in a country where most of the people, they may have a phone, but they're not necessarily digitally literate. So now you want to change everything to working online. You pay with your phone. In South Africa, if you cannot rely on your cell phone as a payment method because you don't know if you're still going to have that phone in 4 hours' time. Having people who are functionally illiterate in their 60s and 70s and 80s, who now have to use all these digital tools simply to participate in society and in civil society. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect was the emphasis that we are placing on all this wonderful new data-driven and big data-driven ideas and the carbon footprint that comes with that. So we're increasing our carbon at the very same time where we are looking at the impact of climate change. And here we see again this dichotomies between what we say, what is really important, what are the main threats in the world, and then all the exciting things that we jump up and down about because that's where the technology is going. And we need to think a little bit about that. I also questioned our assumptions around cities and what the cities of the future is really going to look like. If you look at, I think it was the World Economic Forum that I quoted there, as I said, it's 2 years ago. But they had this thing about at the end of the century, the biggest cities in the world are going to be Bangladesh and Lagos and so on. And I'm looking at the climate change predictions and saying, but at the end of the century, Lagos and Bangladesh are going to be underwater. The whole issue of climate migration that is not being addressed. And I think that there are ways that smart technologies can help us to deal with these issues, to help us manage these issues. But we're not thinking about them. All we are thinking about is the sort of smart and savvy and the things that make the bankers' eyes go like this. And we're not really thinking about the people and how we can help people to prepare for this world that is coming. I think COVID and this whole lockdown has pushed us in many ways to start thinking about that, not just in terms of what is possible, but also in terms of how we make this accessible to the broad range of people on the planet.
And I mean, that's a good link you've made there. As we speak, it's November 2021. So the COP26 Congress of the Parties has just finished. But we're still in the middle, really, of dealing with the global pandemic of COVID-19. So bringing us right up to date, what do you think's the next? Where are we now on this agenda, or what's the next crucial breakthrough, if you like?
A breakthrough in terms of what?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of talk about some of these agendas, some of these issues, but are we really making genuine progress, or is it just hot air from the politicians?
Well, I think seeing that we're now in COP26 and we still have not a binding global agreement to cut our emissions to a level that would keep the planet safe for humans to live on, I think we should stop wasting our money with politicians and with all these talk fests, and to start saying, what is it that we can do as an industry? What is it that we can do as communities? Because I don't think that this is necessarily an individual only way of resolving. I mean, we're not going to save the planet by recycling your plastics. Not that it's not important, but we have much larger things to look at. And the way that things are going now, we more and more need to start talking about how do we adapt, because the world is going to change in ways that we cannot predict, and the things that we do predict is so terrifying that I actually don't want to look at the predictions. But we cannot expect that things are going to go back to some form of normal, that things are going to suddenly, we're no longer going to have fires and flash floods in places like what we're now seeing happening in British Columbia.
Yes.
Or what is happening all over the world, this kind of climate disasters. We're just going to see more and more of those. So it's not about what are the technologies that we're now going to invent so that we can drain lakes, so that we can develop more large houses, that's smart houses, but rather about what are we going to do with people who are going to really start moving about this. Talk about, and I now forget where I read this, about 1.6 billion people who will have to move in the next 40 or 50 years because of climate change, whether through sea level rise, through drought, water, simply it becomes too hot to live in those places. And we're totally ignoring it. We keep on building in these in places that we know is going to become uninhabitable in a few years' time. And it might be in the next decade, it might be in 2 decades, but we're investing an enormous amount of money and resources and energy into developing areas where we should actually be retreating from. And we should start thinking about how are we going to adapt to conditions that we cannot predict. So it's not about, I guess, we know that the temperature is going to go up to 2 degrees, so maybe we can make an adjustment to the HVAC system. The HVAC system is not going to work because it's going to be too hot. What are the other ways that we can deal with it? What are there things that we can learn from how really hot climates have dealt with those kind of temperatures and temperature conditions through their indigenous knowledge systems? What is it that we can learn from there? Or how are we going to use our smart technologies to maybe have nomadic cities that sort of wander the world as we shift between winter and summer, and trying to find a place where we can comfortably exist? So there's all these kind of questions that we need to ask that we're actually not asking.
Well, and thank you. And we've had an insight into your sort of research interests and where that agenda's got to, and your early and a mid-career, as it were. But we know that you're head of department, head of architecture, chair of School of Built Environment. So in those senior leadership roles within the university, what aside from your research, what are the issues that consume you? So what do you wake up worrying about in the morning these days in your senior leadership position?
You're going to laugh, but I lie awake at night worrying if my students have food to eat.
What? Sorry?
If my students have food to eat,
right? Yes.
If they have a comfortable place to sleep, if they can afford to pay the fees that we are getting, if they are coping mentally. So it's my world has sort of shrunk to becoming a mother, if you want to say it, of many, and really caring about this, because in South Africa particularly, it's to access education and to access tertiary education is still very difficult for many people. And even if they manage to get a seat around the table, to keep that seat and to be supported so that they can do their best and they don't have to worry about where am I going to sleep tonight, becomes a real critical issue. So for me, looking at how we can do that for students is important. The second thing is to deal with this whole world of online teaching. And architecture is it's a very difficult animal to teach in an online environment. We found ways, but some of them work, some of them, students learn different skills than they would have learned in the past, but there are key things that get lost. So how do you teach design online? How do you manage all these tools and manage it in such a way that the students who really have difficulty accessing digital environments also are able to follow and to participate? We had a student last year, I remember, who told us that every day she would climb up a hill behind her house with her phone to get reception, and then download the lectures of the previous day and upload her homework, and then have to climb down again. So that's the environment that we work in. So how do we make our teaching accessible and make sure that our students don't fall behind? So that's the second thing. And then the third thing for me, which is very important to my own heart, is to build a culture of research within the architectural fraternity. It's something that architects generally don't think about. They're doers, they like to go out and they're constant problem solvers, but they want to put things there and they want to make things. And to now work within an academic environment where it's not about the buildings that you build, but it is about what is your research, what is the outputs that you do, that you deliver, what is the research that you lead. So for me, the past, I realized the other day with a big shock that I've now been in this position for 6 years.
Yeah.
And in that 6 years, my mission has really been to build up that research capacity in the department. And I must say that my staff has come to the party and performed extraordinary. It's amazing to see how that shift has happened and how they are starting to build their own research careers, and are now starting to ask me about how do I participate in the CIB working groups. So,
excellent. Well, and we go full circle, I hope, or we start another cycle.
exactly,
And the next,
yes.
the next poster person for CIB emerges from under your tutelage. Chrisna, I mean, you made a very good point, a very good reminder there of the different contexts and challenges faced by our members in different parts of the world. But it seems to me, on first reflection, that increased emphasis on the pastoral role that you have for your students, on new models of teaching, particularly in the online context, and encouraging generally a culture of research, are three issues that we would hope that all modern forward-looking leaders in academia would have high on their agenda. So I think you explained and set that out extremely well. Thank you. We've covered your career, we've covered some of the challenges you face, we've covered your research agenda, and we've very nicely covered, thank you, the value of CIB to all of that. And unfortunately, we've already overrun our time, and I hope we might come back and record a second edition because there's so much more really that we should cover. I've only been able to allow you to scratch the surface really of a number of very important points that you raise, including women in academia, women in construction, including inequality in terms of developing countries and funding for research and education and so on, as well as where we're at with the agenda for climate change and well, sorry, not the agenda, but the implementation of adaptation policies for climate change. And also for smart cities. I always finish these chats with a question to you, which I call top opportunity. And in the context of what we've talked about, in the context perhaps of COP26, or any other aspect that we've talked about, the question for you is, in your field of expertise, what would you say is the top opportunity or challenge that you'd want to put to politicians and policymakers to think about?
Ooh, that's a trick question.
It's not meant to be.
And one of the reasons I moved to the university is because I realized after how many years working with politicians and working with government officials and policymakers is that you can have the most wonderful policy in the world. If there's not implementation, then it's just not much more blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg would say.
Yes, yes.
And I don't think that we can rely on policymakers and politicians. We actually need to step forward as people and as leaders to start building community, to start looking at how do we empower our own communities, and whether that community is the community of practice in terms of the industry, or whether that is your community where you live, so that they are knowledgeable about what can be expected, what are ways of possibly addressing it, and then to go forward and start doing things at a grassroots level. I'm a great fan of getting on there and doing things and asking forgiveness later. And I think that's the way that we might be able to change some things, and even if we can't get this whole climate change bus to turn around, because I think it's a little bit later now, but to get us prepared better for what is coming, and to make us as communities much more resilient.
Well, Chrisna, that answer yet again shows that you're no wilting violet, as you've described it yourself, and you've been a magnificent spokesperson and representative of CIB. Thank you for all your contribution to CIB over more than 2 decades, and thank you so much for being our guest today, and for a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I hope we'll be able to see you at World Building Congress 2022 in Melbourne, Australia. If not in person, then online. It will be a great pleasure to welcome you and to give some of our viewers a chance to talk to you personally.
I hope so too.
So thank you for joining us.
COVID and Australian government permitting.
Yes, that's absolutely right, of course. And well, with that, all I can say is thank you so much to our viewers. For more information about all our work, including lots of references to what Chrisna's been talking about, details of other events in this series, see our website, cibworld.org. We always encourage feedback. We always encourage ideas for future people that you'd like to see in this series, or how you'd like to see the series improve. So please contact us at any time at all. And meanwhile, it's just a massive thank you to Chrisna du Plessis. Thank you, Chrisna. And
thank you, Don.
Thank you to everybody for watching this edition of CIB in Conversation. Goodbye.